Hello and welcome to the premiere episode of Outside Bozeman Radio and Podcast, bringing you stories from the greater Yellowstone area and Montana. I'm your host, Leslie Gaines. Our show is sponsored by American Prairie, working to connect, conserve, and rewild more than 3 million acres of prairie grasslands in Montana's Great Plains, one of the most threatened ecosystems worldwide. Visit AmericanPrairie.org for more information. And by Yellowstone Wolf Tracker. Yellowstone Wolf Tracker provides expert local guides who produce memorable wildlife watching experiences year-round in Yellowstone National Park. For more information, check out wolftracker.com. Additional support is provided by Yellowstone Forever, the official nonprofit partner of Yellowstone National Park. They protect, preserve, and enhance Yellowstone National Park through education and philanthropy. Learn more at yellowstone.org. And by the Montana Wildlife Federation. For more than 80 years, the Montana Wildlife Federation has been a leading voice for protecting and enhancing wildlife, public lands, and access at both the state and federal levels. Learn more at montanawildlife.org. Music in today's program was performed by Mandan Sioux flute player Keith Bear. Keith wrote and performed some of the music in the American Buffalo PBS series, which we're about to discuss. Hey guys, I really appreciate you joining me today. It was so nice to meet both of you a few weeks ago to see the first bit of your film. And I got the book, Blood Memory, a few weeks ago, and it's really stunning. The quality of the paper, it's just really amazing.
Thank you.
So, Dayton, you've been doing this for 40, 50 years, and this is your last show, I think, with Ken. Why did the bison excite you so much?
I've been fascinated with this story since I did my first book. It wasn't quite 40 years ago, but almost back in the early 80s. I was retracing the Lewis and Clark journey, writing about my experiences and comparing them with theirs. And of course, among the many differences between their time through the Great Plains and mine in the early 80s was, they ran into buffalo every bend of the Missouri River. And I had to go out of my way to try to find any to at least look at. I think that they present a portal. The story of the American buffalo is a portal into a much larger history of humans interacting with the natural world and humans interacting with themselves. It goes back 10,000 years, and it's an incredibly dramatic, tragic, and also inspiring story. And Ken and I, in some of the films that we made together, told parts of it. In the Name of the West, we talked about the slaughter of the 1870s, at least briefly. In Lewis and Clark, we talked about the time when they're throwing sticks and stones to get them out of the way as they're trying to move westward. And in the national parks, we told the story of the efforts to stop the poaching in Yellowstone National Park in the 1890s to save what was now, became the last free-ranging herd of buffalo that was now down to, a couple dozen. But we wanted to tell the whole story and use that as a way in our continual quest, as Ken would say, to explore, our nation and its people and its history. And I can't think of a better one. And I'm so happy. We kept putting it off for because of other projects, but I can't tell you how happy I am that we finally got around to do this.
I think the viewers on PBS are going to be happy too, because the entire 4 hours is spellbinding.
Thank you.
Ken, let's start off with asking you, bison or buffalo?
Buffalo. Yeah, no, it's the same. I think it's a dead-end street there. The scientists call it bison, as we say in the first moments of the film, but the popular name is buffalo, and we use them interchangeably. And it's helpful when you're writing and talking about them to have a couple of names besides it. And so you can call it whatever you want. But I do think, as Dayton would, I'm sure, agree, that the second largest city in New York State is not going to change its name to Bison. And William F. Cody is not going to change his nickname to Bison Bill. I think Buffalo works pretty well.
It's pretty cool that a lot of this story takes place in Montana, where I live. And I just went over to the Crow Reservation for the Crow Summer Powwow. And when you drive across there, the only thing seems to be missing is the buffalo. How did we get to that place? How do we get rid of 30 or 40 million animals?
Yeah, this is the part of the tragedy that Dayton was mentioning. Buffalo were throughout the continent, and by the beginning of the 19th century, the 1800s, they're limited to the Great Plains mostly, and there are in tens and tens of millions of them. And by the middle of the 1880s, nobody can find one except what's in a zoo or in a private collection. Maybe they're free ranging in Yellowstone, but we're not precisely sure how many there are. It's a combination of factors. Market pressures are number one. And then, people wanted their tongues, and then they wanted their hides to, create leather belts to drive the Industrial Revolution. And they wanted their heads, when they were becoming a little bit more rare, to put on the bar or put in the trophy room. And even the bones, which the hide hunters had left, became valuable in chemical industries. It also had another pretty insidious thing, is that I think people began to understand, it's articulated incredibly well, but incredibly painfully by Theodore Roosevelt, a hero to so many of us, that it might be unfortunate that the buffalo go extinct, but it would be necessary for the advance of white civilization and taking care of our native problem. So while it's not the official policy of the United States government, that was a, quote, pre-presidential TR, I should say, and he does evolve to some extent. It's very clear that if you get rid of the buffalo, you also get rid of the Indian. And there's too many people involved in the entire enterprise who are willing to abide by that horrific calculus.
We know General Sheridan did his best to eliminate the South, and then he moved west. And the whole story is just mind-boggling, that he thought that, okay, we get rid of the buffalo, we'll get rid of the Indians and solve a bunch of problems.
Property is at the heart of a lot of the contemporary arguments in the American West. And it's so interesting that the word property only begins when you've got it. It doesn't matter that somebody might have had it didn't think of it in terms of deeds or ownership, or my land extends to that tree or that mountain range, but nonetheless, we're occupying it for 10,000 or 12,000 years. Yeah, it's a sad story. And, Sheridan is famous for his only good Indian is a dead Indian. The progressives, if you want to call them that at the time, the friends of the Indian, as Dayton points out in the film, are happy to import them to the East and put them in schools and lock off their cues and put them in Western dress and beat them if they speak their languages or manifest their culture. And they're the friends of the Indian who believe that to kill the Indian is to save the man. Those are the people who are helping the Indian. And of course, the Sheridans and the Shermans are in the other camp. So it's an enormous American tragedy that's on us. And yet, as Dayton also says, it's got really powerful, uplifting aspects that we can also take, that are also part of us.
I don't want to cry this early into this interview, but every time I watch Lewis and Clark, especially the end, Dayton, your whole persona with Meriwether Lewis, it's just amazing to watch. When you went on the research trip, how did that change your life?
Inalterably, it changed my life. It was the first book that I wrote, and it was actually a magazine piece that then I turned into a book. And so that fork in the road, if you will, altered the trajectory of my life ever after. I'd been a reporter and I'd been in politics, but, it was my first book. Could have been my last. And I knock on wood and am thankful that it turned out it wasn't. But also the Lewis and Clark story really put its hooks into me and into my bloodstream and my heart. Something about the adventure of it, something about the meaning of it as the first official venture westward by this young nation that was more huddled on the Atlantic coast than what it is now. And the notion that they kept good journals, and the notion that they were seeing this beautiful, bounteous land before we followed them as a nation and changed it forever. And so they're a benchmark for it in many respects, and particularly so with the buffalo. When they embarked to the west, they were bumping into them all the time through what is now Montana and other parts of the Great Plains. They threw sticks and stones at them to get them out of the way. Lewis said one hunter could supply a regiment with food, and they only shot the ones that enough to eat, which would have been a nice example for us all to have followed. But it's just a great story. It had great meaning for me. Ken and I made a documentary film specifically about them. We referred to them in our film on the West as well. And since that first journey in 1983 out along the whole trail and back, I've done that 4 times, but also gone to at least some portion of the Lewis and Clark Trail every year since then. So it's I call it Lewis and Clark-itis, and I've got a lifelong affliction of it. But I think they offer up, a lot of questions about, what happened after them. And some of it was good, and some of it, and particularly with the buffalo and its intertwined story with Native people, was one of the great tragedies of our history.
I've owned a copy of Out West for many years, and I was rereading it in the past couple of weeks. And how would the world of Dayton Duncan and Ken Burns changed if your Volkswagen van didn't make it?
I don't even want to contemplate that.
They break down a lot.
So there were a couple of times when I thought it wasn't going to. And I had to self-administer a Heimlich to myself on the Pacific coast when I almost gagged on a chocolate-covered huckleberry. Luckily, the front of a Volkswagen bus is flat, and so I could sort of thrust myself into it with my fist in the right place and cough up that. That would have been a heck of a way to end my journey. At least I'd seen the ocean, I guess.
So tell me how you met Gerard Baker.
I met him. He was just a young interpreter at Fort Union at the mouth of the Yellowstone River. He was dressed in buckskins, and he was given a demonstration of throwing a tomahawk and doing other things that his people, the Mandans and Hidatsas, had done for years. We struck up a conversation. The next thing I knew, he invited me to sit in a sweat lodge he had made along the shores of the Missouri River up there by Fort Union. And the next thing I knew, I was crashing. He allowed me to sleep on the couch of the trailer where he and Mary Kay were living. And the next thing I knew after that, he'd asked if I would mind babysitting his two kids for a night, because he and Mary Kay hadn't had a date for 4 years, it seemed, or something, since their first child was born. So I said sure. And it's one of the great fortuitous moments of my life. It's been from that moment a lifelong friendship, and I've watched him rise through the ranks of the National Park Service to become the superintendent at Little Bighorn, to become the first Native superintendent at Mount Rushmore, to be in charge of the National Park Service's celebration of the commemoration, I should say, of the Lewis and Clark bicentennial. His mother, with his mother's blessing, I was adopted into their clan of the Hidatsas, and he considers my children his nieces and nephew, and I consider his children my nieces and nephew. And so it's been a great friendship, and I treasure it. And he taught me, actually. He's the one that inculcated into me that the story of the American buffalo is the story of Native people's interaction with them, and it's also the story of their history once the United States expanded westward. And to a great extent, he got me going on that bison trail, and he got Ken on it as well. And we're just so lucky, both of us, that we can call him our friend. And he's a terrific person in our film, as he was in the Lewis and Clark film, and as he was in our film on the national parks.
We now watched Lewis and Clark again last week, and I realized that we're all getting old.
I had hair, I think, or at least some.
Maybe you can get some buffalo hair transplanted in your forehead.
Yeah, I should, yeah.
He's such a good man, and he just brings so much to the film. Tell me about when he was the ranger at the North Unit at Teddy Roosevelt, and you went there with him, and you had your first big encounter with a buffalo bull.
Yeah. By that point, he was the district ranger in the North Unit at Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. Part of his duty was to keep track of the buffalo herd that's there. And I was spending about a week, staying at his house and, doing more research on my book about Lewis and Clark. And word came down that 2 bulls had escaped, gotten through a fence somewhere, and no one knew where they were, but his job was going to be to track them down if they were close enough to be herded back, to do that if they were too far and threatened, getting too much tangled in with the neighboring ranches, then his job was to shoot them. And we spent half a day finding them, and when we did, they were too far. And so he pulled his rifle out of the scabbard, behind his pickup truck, and said a couple of dots of prayers and brought him down. And then he and I skinned them. And by his tradition, after we'd opened up their guts, he carved off a piece of liver and on his big knife and pointed it at me and said, "It's our tradition to have a bite of this, so you'll get the strength of that and the spirit of that buffalo." And Gerard is about 6'5", 6'6", and braids down to his shoulders and a big knife with, holding a glistening piece of liver. He says, "Eat, you eat." That was a special moment. And we ate a little bit of the kidney too. And then we skinned the buffalo, and they got some trucks out, and they took the carcasses back to the Piggly Wiggly in Watford City for distribution to the Fort Berthold Reservation. And the skins and the heads that we severed were going to the Fort Union Historic Site. And the next morning, we fried up the rest of the liver and kidneys and testicles and had a scrumptious breakfast of it. And that's kind of a hard experience to forget.
That's a whole new way to have a testicle festival, because it makes Angus nuts look kind of small.
Yeah.
The only time I've ever seen Gerard was, I think it was at the Mammoth Hotel in Yellowstone, and he was walking down this hallway, and like you said, he's 6'5", and he had on this big old buffalo fur coat.
Robe, yeah.
And he looked like such a badass.
He's every inch the part. One of my favorite stories has nothing to do with the buffalo, nothing to do with the West, though we've been out there many times. And of course, he plays, as Dayton suggested, an enormous role in this new film because of his passion and his feeling of communicating what it might be like to be the father of a family that you can no longer feed because all of the buffalo have been killed. And the pain it brought this big, gigantic, big-hearted man to tears. But he visited us in the East, and I just put my third of 4 daughters in college a few weeks ago. And when she was just a little baby, he came in, and I have a New England farmhouse that was built in 1820. It's not built for people of Gerard's stature. So he had to bend over double just to go into the stairway to climb up to the second floor and bow under the door to go in. Even kneeling, he was much taller than my daughter and her mom, who were sitting in a chair, and he made a Mandan blessing in this tiny little room, which he completely filled up with his size and his spirit. And I'll never forget that blessing that he gave to my Olivia.
It's pretty wild that your first taste of that liver was the beginning of the Buffalo Brother clan, it seems like, Dayton.
Yeah, that's quite an introduction to the species. I'd been west when I was a kid, but When we were in Yellowstone, it was the day after the 59 earthquake. And so we were shut off from the part where you might have seen some bison. So I don't recall seeing any. And so it wasn't really until I was, 25 years later doing my research on out west that I got to encounter some buffalo. And, as it turns out, it was much more than just sort of looking at them from a distance. We went into an earth lodge in North Dakota. Gerard and I did that he had made, and we had buffalo tripe, to eat, and he had me sleep on and under buffalo robes. We went into the sweat lodge that he had made along the Missouri River and used a buffalo tail to dip in water and splash on the rocks to, get your sweat going. And that's when he would tell me stories of when you're properly cleansed, the stories of his people, including, how important the buffalo were. So he's, besides becoming a good friend and a buffalo brother of mine, he was a great teacher too.
I've been fortunate enough, I think I might have been in that same Earth Lodge. Amy Mossett and I filmed over there, and I went into one of the Earth Lodges there, and I was just trying to imagine living in there with 3 or 4 horses and all of your relatives and your kids, and that would have been a way to warm it up.
Yeah, it sure would.
40 below zero would still be kind of tough.
Yeah.
So basically, Gerard was the beginning of your Buffalo Brother clan. So tell me about some of the other members of your clan. You've got some really interesting people in this film.
Well, Ken can talk about what a treasure George horse captures, and I would include in that too. You might as well talk a little bit about our long friendship with Scott Momaday.
Yeah, I think that, we weren't kicking the can with the buffalo, but we were just waiting for that moment. Some projects you just say yes to and you start them right away. And some projects you say yes to and somehow you just have to find the right place. And I think we all feel pretty good about having waited because it gave us a chance to really, I hope, become better filmmakers, to benefit from new scholarship, but also I think to privilege a lot of voices that aren't necessarily privileged in a story like this. Sometimes you pay lip service or there's some kind of paternalistic nod in a direction, but, the Native American speakers in the film are dominant and they are remarkable. And Dayton's right. We've had a long relationship with Scott Momaday, who is just an amazing storyteller and a great teacher and mentor and a wonderful poet and writer, and was a huge part of the West and the way we kind of tried to figure out how to dismount from that hugely complicated story. And we stayed in touch with him, and he's wonderful in this. I think that George Horsecapture Jr., in a way, represents the best of us. There's a kind of prick of conscience that takes place when we think about the buffalo, and also by the buffalo's brethren, Native people. And the Native folks from a variety of tribes, including Gerard and Jermaine White and Marcia Pablo and Rosalind Lapierre and Scott and others, descendants of Quanah, a consulting producer who's also a descendant of Quanah Parker of the Quahada Band of Comanche, give us a kind of new way of seeing it. It isn't just allowing a group to pay lip service, but to really overtake the film. And there's a wonderful moment. It's ironic and it's bittersweet. It's painful to hear. In 1913, we made an Indian head nickel for the first time with a buffalo on the back. We know the brave, the man, the warrior who's on the front, and we know the name and the bison that was the model for the sculptor. And that bison went right down to the meatpacking district in Manhattan's West Side and was parted out for meat. And it seems to me so ironic that we're beginning to feel, and have been feeling for a few decades, this anxiety that we're losing the thing that was our identity, the frontier. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote this famous essay in 93 that the frontier was closed, and it caused a lot of anxiety for Americans. We were beginning to add more national parks in an attempt to balance off all that we had taken, all that we had despoiled, all the trees we'd cut down, all the rivers we diverted or dammed or canyons that we'd excavated. And that was the good impulse. I think that there was a sense that the symbol of us were these two entities that we'd actually spent the last century trying to kill, and there's an incredibly painful part to that. And yet underneath it, as George says, do you have to destroy George Horsecapture Jr.? Do you have to destroy the things you love? And it's a really good question for a group of humans, as Dayton was referring to, not all humans, but a group of humans who decided their obvious and natural superiority in the world as species. We are the dominant species. Gave us a kind of license for the scope of the destruction. The largest slaughter of wildlife in the history of the world is taking place, not just the buffalo, but also the elk and the grizzly and the wolf and the coyote and stuff like that. It's a powerful story, and it's sad, and it's something that we sort of have to own in order to get past it. And so I think people like George Horsecapture Jr. and Scott Momaday and Gerard and Jermaine White and Roz LaPierre and others have a kind of poetic dynamic to the way they see it. They feel this animal because they have a relationship of 600 generations, as Jermaine says, and the best we can muster is maybe 6. And so we've learned, and we quote Wallace Stegner in the film, that man is the most dangerous species, and every other species, including the earth itself, has reason to fear us. But we're also the only species that, when we want, can save something. So just as Lincoln hoped on the eve of the Civil War to appeal to our better angels, I think we tried to find in this incredibly tragic story those places where you find human beings who make a journey. TR doesn't go probably far enough as he could have, but he goes a great distance. And there are people like Charlie Goodnight and Michelle Pablo and George Bird Grinnell and others who really, over the course of their lifetime, help us understand and move us into a world where conservation is not a dirty word, where, the saving of a species is important. But I think it all originates with the native voices and the kind of, even in the face of what has taken place to them and their animal, that they have a kind of generosity and a worldview that we would be so wise to adopt.
What did the buffalo mean to the Kiowas? I mean, it was their life.
Their lifeways for many tribes, not just the Kiowas, but many of the Plains tribes. The buffalo is everything. It's an animal that you use in, sustainable isn't even the word. I mean, they're using everything from the tail to the snout, and even the snort, Gerard suggests, because the sounds and the grunts are going into rituals and dances and things like that. The waste is used because it's in a treeless plain, a source of fuel for fires. Everything is being used. And in exchange for killing the buffalo, as Dayton wrote so beautifully in the film, they worship them. And so what you have with the Kiowas is also this notion that buffalo are at the beginning of their creation story. How they configure themselves is that this is the most spiritual of beings. And they believe that it came out of one of the highest promontories in the Wichita Mountains in what is now Oklahoma, a place that we now label Mount Scott. And it was back to their stories go that the buffalo left as the slaughter intensified on the Great Plains. It's so wonderfully ironic that one of the first wildlife refuges that was set aside by now President Roosevelt, is there. And that, one of the great, you can't make this up, nobody in Hollywood could figure this out, that they seed the stock of buffalo, the herd for that refuge, they needed to go to the Bronx Zoo. And so the animals were crated up and sent west back to, as we say, their new old home. And, the story just has layers and layers. And as Dayton suggests, it sort of ripples out. And this animal, it's obviously a magnificent beast, our national mammal now, the largest land mammal in North America, is intertwined with so many aspects of our national narrative that it's hard, in a way, when you see and funnel an entire story through their eyes, that it doesn't just touch into every corner of who we've been and who we are now, and hopefully where we're going. We like to think of this film as the first two acts, the two parts of it, of a 3-act play. And a lot of that third act is yet to be written. And a lot of it poses some really tough questions. Okay, you can pat yourself on your back. You've saved this beast. It's no longer extinct. They're not tens of millions. There's 350, 375, 380,000. And most of them are in corrals and feedlots being sustainably managed. But what would it mean if we could restore the Great Plains back to its glory as the American Serengeti? What would it mean to set aside parcels of land large enough where the buffalo could roam and the deer and the antelope could play? What would it do for us to say that we had not just preserved a zoo species that we could observe, but we could do that? And there are people, native peoples, 80 tribes in the Intertribal Buffalo Council and lots of NGOs who are working to try to create just such habitats, just such ecosystems large enough to take the now relatively silent monoculture of the Great Plain and return it to the full glory, flora as well as fauna, that it once was when Lewis and Clark first kind of became the first Americans to walk on this territory. And I think the reason why we love Lewis and Clark, and I was thinking of it as Dayton was speaking so passionately, is that they represent that moment when it began. It didn't have to be what it was, which is the tragedy a good deal of our film describes. But the fact that we still hold them dear means there is a huge part of us that has a internal adherence to the Eden that this place was, not unpopulated, but the Eden that it was.
What do you think spawned the whole reckless greed of what we did? I mean, you look at Manifest Destiny. How do you explain that?
Yeah, Manifest, it's money. It's land, it's money. De Tocqueville came in the 1830s and talked about the American religion as being the almighty dollar, right? 50 years later, Lord James Bryce came by and said, what's all this haste? We have cities bigger than you in Europe and we're not happy. Why can't you remember what it was like when you burst into this silent Eden? It wasn't silent and it wasn't empty. It was an Eden. And I think Manifest Destiny has, as George Horst Capture says to it, a kind of momentum that everything just has to get out of its way so that we can, or spread the continent for our yearly multiplying millions. And we did. And there are consequences to that. And they still resound and they're still there. And I think we're trying to figure out what are the dimensions of the repair necessary to contain this story. And a lot of it has to do with saving the buffalo. A lot of it has to do is reconfiguring our relationship to Native people. We've made them a single people, and there's 300 nations, some of them as distinct as Germans are from French. And we just lump them all into one category, which is under the heading other, or worse, savages, and learned very little. And, it takes people like George Bird Grinnell, a real hero in our story, to understand what we could have done that was a little bit different, that would have perhaps changed a little bit of the trajectory. And as we say over and over again, and with passion, Dayton, in the film, it wasn't inevitable. It wasn't inevitable. And I think we have to really examine our motives. And your question is to the heart of it. That people needed leather to run the machines of the Industrial Revolution. So guess what? We'll go and slaughter 30 million buffalo in just the blink of an eye.
When I was a little kid, I must have been 10 or 12 years old. My aunt and uncle lived in Amarillo, Texas. They took me to Paladura Canyon. And I never had any idea that there were buffalo in Paladura Canyon. And the whole part of the story, because of the wife of Mr. Goodnight, she had a lot to do with his interest.
What fascinated me in working on this film, or one of the things that fascinated me, I'd been studying buffalo and their story and how it intertwines with the larger American saga, obviously for 30 whatever years. But what really struck me as I was looking at these individuals who, at the turn of that century, for one reason or another, decided they were going to try to save a few buffalo. And they all had different reasons. And as we point out, some of them were not the most honorable, but they still were directed toward not letting this species go. And in the Palo Duro Canyon, Charles Goodnight, who had fought Indians as a Texas Ranger, who had started the first cattle drives up out of Texas into Colorado and Kansas and ultimately farther, was the first rancher to move into the panhandle of Texas once the slaughter had ended, and actually took part in it. He had his cowboys go and make sure if there are any stragglers still left to get rid of them. And his wife, Molly, begged him to save a few, and my belief is, she's there on a ranch and then the closest neighbor is 70 miles away in the panhandle of Texas. And they were childless, and a couple buffalo calves helped keep her company. And that started a herd. And as Ken, you mentioned about Theodore Roosevelt, Charlie Goodnight, a lot of the people in this film go through, changes. And certainly Charlie Goodnight's was one. From buffalo, from Indian fighter and cattleman, he remained a cattleman all of his life, but disdainer of native people and of buffalo, to someone who started raising them, became very infatuated with the whole notion of them, and then befriended the tribes he used to fight by offering to the Kiowas a buffalo bull for their Sundance. It was required for them to have a Sundance, and there weren't any buffalo left anywhere except in private ranches. And so he gave them one to use. He did the same for the Taos Pueblo, who needed, buffalo parts and other things for some of their ceremonies. He befriended Quanah Parker, who himself had gone through a transformation from one of the greatest white haters, particularly Texas haters of the Comanches and a renowned warrior, to someone trying to lead his people through the tough times of reservation life. What was fascinating to me, and it reminded me of, Ken, of the film we did on the national parks, which was, people usually think national parks came from the top down. The government proclaims a national park, Congress passes a law. And what we learned in the research on that was, under every rock of every national park is a story of a person, or a small group of people who fell in love with a place and determined that they would do everything they could to try to preserve it and protect it for future generations. And finally, Congress would make them into national parks. The buffalo story is similar in that respect. There are like 7 or 8 different places where do-it-yourself, preservation efforts, sometimes to try to make a profit, and sometimes to honor false belief about national character, and sometimes just out of a desire to not let another species be extinguished. But all those stories ultimately finally come together for a national movement that really did save the buffalo from extinction. And to me, that is just such a fascinating and story, that we tend to always think that the way things are, a national bison range was probably, an act of Congress. Yes, it was, but it didn't start there. It's the acts of people. And hopefully when a democracy is working well, they can be involved in things to make things for the better. That's the other side of that coin that Ken was describing. It's both a ironic thing that we put portrait of an Indian on one side and a buffalo on the other, after we had spent a century trying to essentially exterminate them. But it also it happened at a time when we were trying to say, let's see if we can actually change course, go in a different direction, and make things better. I can't think of any more dramatic American story that I know, and there are lots and lots of them, obviously, but none that I can think of that demonstrate that. Our power to exterminate, as Wallace Stegner said, but also, if we choose to, our ability and power to save what we otherwise might destroy.
Parts of the film and the book is the whole relationship between Quanah Parker and Charles Goodnight. And you see how they had such respect for each other.
Yeah, it's so moving in a way. And I think what we are approving of is the possibility in us to make these kinds of changes, to move ourselves from whatever stuck place we're in. And as I said before, TR goes a long way, not far enough probably, but these two men, Quanah and Charlie, have really make a really substantially great journey. And they remind us both of the tragic dimensions of this narrative, but also its more hopeful possibilities if these two old natural enemies can not only repair, but actually move, together in such spectacular fashion.
We're looking at what's the future going to be for buffalo. I was reading yesterday, I think in the New York Times, there's a whole new movement to get rid of barbed wire in the West. And they have these new little GPS doggy shock collars they're putting on cows, and they're going to have virtual fences. I just can't even imagine putting a electric shock collar on a 2,500-pound buffalo is going to work out.
You do it, okay? Tell us how it works out there. Yeah, just let us know.
Yeah, they're looking for volunteers to attach those collars to a bison bull.
Right.
The brucellosis argument, to me, doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. How did the brucellosis thing even begin?
It's interesting that brucellosis didn't start with buffalo. It was a cattle disease, a bovine disease. As nearly as people can tell, they think that it was sometime in the early 1900s that the Yellowstone herd, some parts of the herd, contracted brucellosis from cattle that were being there at the park. They had milk cows and other things, to feed the tourists and so forth. So it started from cattle to bison, and, they can carry the disease, and the disease, if it's contracted by cattle herds, can be, very disastrous for the rancher by causing aborted births and other things. There's no documented case, at least that's what I'm told, of bison to cattle transmission of brucellosis. Elk also have brucellosis, and they're allowed to roam freely wherever they want to go. They're also allowed to be hunted, and I think that may have something to do with it. It's that fear that this disease might be transmitted if buffalo were roaming too much. The other part of it is just, as it always is in the West, with, you name the grazing animal, whether it's buffalo, sheep, or cattle, it's all about the grass. It's, whose grass is it, and who has first claim to it, and how can I keep anybody else from having, or any other animal, interfere with the grass that, I'm grazing my cattle on. It's a very touchy issue. And I think and that's why, as Ken said, this third act that is underway right now, we allude to it at the end of our film, but only time will tell how it succeeds, of this very substantial effort now by the Intertribal Buffalo Council to distribute buffalo to reservations where they can live in much larger spaces when there can be many more of these herds, therefore, making sure that the species does thrive and can reconnect the native people with this animal for whom they've had a kinship and sense of reciprocity that dates back 10,000 years, but was severed 100 and some years ago. It's a very, I think, amazing and exciting endeavor that's going on right now. And we should say that Juliana Branham, who's a consulting producer for us, who's, as Ken mentioned, is a Comanche, a descendant of Quanah Parker herself, has made a wonderful 18, 20-minute film that's simply about that effort. It follows a fellow who was a advisor to our film, Jason Valdez, who's from the Wind River Shoshone Reservation and a biologist, but who's been involved in restoring bison on tribal lands, as he brings some bison from the Denver Zoo back to his home reservation and talks about how important that is and what that means to the tribe, not only for the spiritual reasons, but also for food sovereignty. It's called Homecoming, and it's a beautiful film.
That's going to be really interesting to see. You know, I met you guys up at American Prairie, and they are doing their best to assemble pieces of land together to rewild the prairie.
Yeah, it's a really pretty significant effort, and they're nicely up against Charles M. Russell and Fort Belknap, and sort of adds to their automatically to their acreage, and they're just acquiring property so that you may have that ability to have a place where the buffalo roam.
I live in Big Timber, and you drive around town and there's a couple of signs, you know, stop American Prairie. They're going to end the life of ranchers. And I just think that's such nonsense. How do we get past this bureaucratic discrimination against buffalo?
It's, you know, it's a complicated thing. Whenever anything goes into the binary, you know, like a 1 and a 0 in our computer world, or the red state, the blue state, you know, the arguments become simplistic and not like the brucellosis, not really accurate. And, you know, American Prairie isn't stealing anybody's land. They're buying it. People can sell or they don't have to sell. This is land, by the way, that people have had for maybe 2 or 3 generations. And we're talking about restoring a system that obtained for 600 human generations, and God knows how many generations of the bison themselves. I just think that we set up these false, you know, enemies, and then spend way too many times tilting at the windmills. And we're, you know, these are natural people with, it's the love of the land, it's the love of the prairie, and that ought to be enough to bring people together, but it isn't, because, you know, what we do is mostly argue, and what we do is mostly tell stories, because we what we believe, the novelist Richard Powers says, the best arguments in the world won't change anybody's mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story. And so we're in the story business. We hope we're in the good story business. We think this is one of the better stories to tell.
What do you think's going to happen? I called and emailed the governor's office, Gianforte. I emailed the state veterinarian of Montana to try to get them to put in some information on this, and they wouldn't even return a phone call or email. There's like some hard edges here.
It's too bad, and doesn't necessarily have to be that, but folks sometimes like to be dug in.
It reminds me in a certain way of many of the stories that we encountered when we did our film on the national parks.
Yep.
When the Grand Canyon would have been the second national park in the world in the 1880s, when it was first proposed as one, and the local opposition to it, oh, you're going to ruin Arizona. Theodore Roosevelt made his visit there and said, my God, this thing needs to be preserved, you know, leave it as it is. And didn't go anywhere, but finally he used the executive powers of the Antiquities Act and set it aside as a national monument. Politicians and others in Arizona went ballistic. They took him to court. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court, which fortunately for us all, said that's a legitimate, you know, exercise of the Antiquities Act. And then it took another 10 or 15 years for what I would say is one of probably the preeminent self-evident national parks to become a national park. Generation after that, you know, the Grand Canyon appears on the license plate of Arizona. It's never easy. You know, the things of conservation and preservation, we sometimes take it all for granted. And what we hope in some of the stories that we have told about national parks and this one is just saying, buckle up, cowboy. This could be a rough ride here, friend. And it often is. But as John Muir said, if when you do it, the generations yet unborn will rise up and call you blessed. That's the reward you get.
This whole opposition thing, I mean, look at Bears Ears, look at the national monuments, Kaparowitz Plateau, and places like that in Utah. It's just a giant fight.
Yeah.
It's always like that, but as Dayton says, the Grand Canyon's one example, Kenai Fjords, a national park and near Seward, the opposition to that was so intense, burning the Secretary of Interior in effigy and President Carter in effigy. And, suddenly they realized that with all the ups and downs of the oil industry, that the permanent pipeline was tourism, and they quietly asked the government to expand it. Stick around.
I just think we can't give up. You got to keep fighting the good fight. Persistence goes a long way. One of the saddest things I saw about the film is the whole way that Sitting Bull ended up.
Yeah.
That he was going around the world with Buffalo Bill and depressed, and he was giving away his money to homeless people as he got paid, and then he comes home and gets killed. I mean, how in the hell did that happen?
Yeah, it's terrible. And, it's the richest country on earth, and he doesn't understand why they're homeless and beggars on the streets of New York City. And it strikes him in a way that he doesn't get it. He tires of it. He goes back home. And then, of course, he's caught up all in the just horrific final denouement of the Indian resistance and accidentally killed, but also killed and murdered. And it's horrific. And, this incredibly, symbol, and he's named after a buffalo.
Dayton, you've been doing this a long time, and this is your last film. Tell me about that.
Oh, I've reached a certain age that could at least raise that possibility. But the main thing is I've had this great run with Ken. I've had the honor of working with the person I consider the best documentary filmmaker of a generation at least, and pursued topics that I was particularly interested in on the ones that I produced and wrote, either because I was already passionate about it or just powerfully curious about and wanted to learn more about. And, like to think that we made some awful good documentaries that reached millions of people. As a writer, the notion that words that I wrote reach, 35, 40 million people on some of the films is, a dream come true. And written the companion books often that go along with them. And Buffalo was one of the ones that I wanted in this list that I gave him a long time ago when he looked exactly like he looks now, and I actually had hair. But it was on that list, and we winnowed through them. And I don't have any others right now that I feel the great urge to do. But I do feel a great urge to, as doing this, there are a number of book projects that I put over to the side, and I'm looking forward to doing it. I would like to be a hero in the eyes of my beloved wife, Diane, who's been waiting patiently. We could change her name to Penelope, I guess. She's been waiting for me to come home and spend more time there. And so I'm going to be doing both of those things. But, I just can't adequately express how darn lucky I feel. We met by chance and realized that we shared a passion for two things, for storytelling, but also a passion for this experiment in democracy that began on July 4th, 1776, and believe in that, and believe in those words. And a lot of our films have dealt with how we doing on that journey, where do we go wrong and where do we go right? And I feel blessed that for 30 plus years, I was able to pursue stories that I was interested in with my buddy, who's the best documentary filmmaker of his generation.
Do you still have that Volkswagen van?
It was my sister's. I'd never even owned it. I borrowed it from my sister who was overseas at the time, and gave it back to her after putting 100,000 miles on it. Thanks, sis. It needs a little oil now. And she then and her husband drove it all across Canada, and they'd driven it across Europe and into Turkey. And she was working for an oil company in Iran, and they had it in Iran. That was a great vehicle. And I don't know, 10 years after I took it on my Lewis and Clark journey, she wrote me and said, we just have to get rid of this Volkswagen. Do you want it? And I really thought, why? Yeah, of course I do. And I thought, no, I just park it in a barn in New Hampshire and never drive it. I called it the Discovery. It was my name for it. But I have this vision that right now it's rattling around somewhere, on an adventure to fill out its portfolio, because it's been in every state and all the Canadian provinces, much of Mexico, and all across Europe. And like I say, they drove through Kurdish villages at night in Turkey to get back to Iran. So it's had quite an adventure.
We know that you're going to drive back out west at some point and go see Gerard. So maybe as a going away present, Ken needs to give you a brand new electric VW van.
Electric.
There you go.
Right. Yeah.
There you go. That's a great idea.
So what's next for you, Ken?
I'm not stopping. We've got the Buffalo coming out. We've got our first non-American topic that's, more than halfway edited on Leonardo da Vinci. That'll be out next year. We're working on a big, huge series on the history of the American Revolution, really complicated story, 6 parts, 12 plus hours. That'll be out in 2 years on the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord. And we're working on a film about the most misunderstood period in American history, Reconstruction, called Emancipation to Exodus. We're doing a history of crime and punishment in the United States. We've been filming for years for a film, and are just going to do some more filming next week on LBJ and his Great Society program, and got a couple of other projects filming folks who knew Dr. King and other interesting figures in American history. So, I like to say that if I were given 1,000 years to live, we wouldn't run out of topics in American history. So we're just going, and we got a young group of people who are coming up, and they're terrific, including my oldest daughter and her husband. And so it just, we're trying to just continue to tell our stories. And, as we've said from the very beginning, we feel like we're making the same film over and over again. It's a different subject matter, but it's just asking the question that Dayton was saying about, who we are, where have we done it right, where have we done it wrong, how can we be better, where are those better angels that Lincoln talked about, where's our conscience, what do we do to repair? One of the main themes of the Buffalo is resilience, and it's resilience of the animal, it's resilience of the native peoples who depended on that animal, and it's just in itself a story about resilience. It's at its heart. And that's a really powerful thing. We like to think of ourselves as emotional archaeologists, not just excavating dry dates and facts and events. That just suggests that there might be a test next Tuesday.
It's funny, as a filmmaker, I can't count the number of times that I've sat in an edit studio and the editor goes, "Why don't you just Ken Burns this?" You give it the Ken Burns effect, and they'll set up some still pictures on a stand and have my camera there, and they'll put a rubber band on the tripod handle and use it to move smoothly across the picture. And they go, "Yeah, that's the budget Ken Burns effect."
No, that is the Ken Burns effect. We've been doing that for decades and decades by hand.
So what inspires you about the future of all this, Ken?
I just think there's something so intoxicating and irresistible about a good story, and something you didn't know. You think you know about stuff, and even the Buffalo having, as Dayton said, done something on it in the West and in Lewis and Clark and in national parks, and then there's that much more to know about. And it's an exciting thing. I don't know anything I love more, besides family, than trying to make a film better, working hard. Sometimes it's cutting things down. Sometimes it's adding stuff. Sometimes it's an idea.
You guys are going to miss each other, I think.
Oh, yeah. He's not going to get that far away.
I'm not that far away.
He thinks that he'll be in. We'll make him come to all the screenings of the new films because he'll be the best warm body there is, right? He will be able to see it from a bystander's point of view and be able to see it from somebody with a lot of filmmaking mileage on his tires.
But, you get him that electric fan, he'll be able to make it over there in one charge.
Yeah, there you go.
You guys have had such an incredible career together.
It's been fun. I can't imagine it not happening.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you joining me today, and it's just such a great story. The book is gorgeous. The film is gorgeous. And it's going to be great for America to have 4 hours of television that doesn't involve politics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Amen.
Good luck, Dayton. Maybe I'll see you wandering around out west.
I hope so.
You can always come camp at my house in Big Timber, Montana. You guys take care. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The American Buffalo can be streamed on your local PBS station and with PBS Passport. Blood Memory is available in the PBS online store or at your local bookstore. Thanks for joining us today on the Outside Bozeman Radio and Podcast, made possible by American Prairie, Yellowstone Wolf Tracker, Yellowstone Forever, and the Montana Wildlife Federation.